They sent a man to evict the drifter from the lighthouse. He hadn't seen the repairs yet. Reeve Sutter had $16, a duffel bag with a set of electrical and mechanical tools he'd assembled piece by piece over 8 months on the road, and a habit of walking coastlines rather than highways whenever the terrain allowed it. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten maritime infrastructure that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 20 years old, laid off from a Coast Guard contractor's aids to navigation maintenance crew 8 months earlier, when a round of federal budget cuts eliminated his entire regional position, and he had been moving down the coast ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The layoff notice had cited fiscal restructuring in language considerably more polished than what it actually meant. That a private contractor had decided a technician's specialized skill in maintaining fixed lights and mechanical fog signals was no longer worth the line item, now that most stations along the coast had been converted to unmanned solar beacons, requiring nothing more than an annual battery check. Reeve had spent 8 months since then relearning, coastal town by coastal town, that the particular knowledge his father had spent a career teaching him mattered a great deal less to most employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. He found the lighthouse at Cormorant Point on a foggy autumn afternoon, a white masonry tower rising 80 feet above a rocky headland, its lantern room dark, a modern solar-powered beacon mounted on a small automated pole beside it, blinking on a timer with no relation at all to the tower looming silently above it. A weathered sign at the base of the access road read, "Cormorant Point Light, decommissioned, property of Cape Holdings, LLC, no trespassing." Reeve stood at the base of the tower a long while before he climbed the interior stairs anyway. He had grown up the son of a Coast Guard aids to navigation technician, riding along on lighthouse and buoy maintenance runs from the age of 10, learning the specific mechanics of fixed lights and mechanical foghorns. The difference between a system merely decommissioned and one actually damaged beyond use. A distinction that had never once failed him even after the budget cuts took away the only steady work he'd ever wanted to do. Inside the lantern room, the original 4th-order Fresnel lens still sat in its brass housing, clouded with decades of salt grime but intact, and below it, in the tower's service room, a diesel-powered foghorn compressor sat silent, its belts gone brittle, its housing coated in rust. He walked the tower's interior slowly before he touched anything, the way his father had always insisted a man learn a station before presuming to fix it. The masonry walls showed no cracking, only surface weathering. The iron spiral stairs, though rusted, held solid under his weight at every landing. The lamp's rotation mechanism, a clockwork weight-driven system common to lights of this era, sat frozen but visibly intact, its gears showing no signs of the kind of damage that would put true repair beyond a patient man's reach. He did not have a plan yet beyond understanding what he was looking at. In 8 months on the road, he had learned that was usually plan enough to start with. He walked into the nearby fishing village the next morning looking for day work, and found, within his first hour at the harbor, that the lighthouse carried more weight in local worry than its decommissioned sign suggested. That light and horn kept boats off Cormorant Shoal for over a century, said a weathered woman coiling line at the harbor dock, introducing herself as Nora Blythe, captain of one of the village's remaining fishing boats. Coast Guard automated the light back in the 90s, put in that little solar beacon, and figured that was good enough. Problem is, that beacon's just a light, no horn at all, works fine on a clear night, does nothing for us in a real fog. And this stretch of coast gets fog thick enough some mornings that you can't see your own bow rail, let alone a shoal marker a half-mile out. Anybody lost a boat to it since the horn stopped running? Reeve asked. Nora's face went still. The Marguerite J, 4 years back, ran aground on the shoal in a fog thick as soup, lost 2 men getting her crew off before she broke apart. Coast Guard's own report called it an unavoidable accident. Half this harbor's called it something else ever since, on account of the fact that the old horn would have warned them off that shoal a mile out, fog or no fog. She studied Reeve a moment. Why the interest? No reason, Reeve said, which was, as it seemed to be for anyone answering that particular question in any town exactly like this one, a lie. Nora Blythe, as Reeve learned over his first several days in the village, had spent years petitioning both the Coast Guard and Cape Holdings LLC, the private company that had acquired the decommissioned Lighthouse property, to reactivate some form of fog signal at Cormorant Point, without success. Coast Guard says it's not their asset anymore, so it's not their responsibility, Nora said on Reeve's third visit to the harbor. Cape Holdings says the light's a historic curiosity they intend to eventually redevelop into some kind of private residence, and a working foghorn isn't part of anybody's business plan for that. I've got fishermen in this harbor who go out every foggy morning trusting nothing but a solar blinker that does them no good at all, once the fog rolls in thick. The mockery, when it came mostly from two younger harbor hands who unloaded catch at the dock each morning, one of whom made a point of asking, loud enough for Reeve to hear across the pier, whether the drifter squatting at the old light understood that a private company owned the land under his feet and would have him removed the moment they noticed. Reeve said nothing to that, because he had learned, over 8 months of exactly this kind of comment, in exactly this kind of town, that defending yourself to men who had already decided what you were rarely changed anything except your own dignity. Nora started climbing up to the lighthouse most evenings once her boat was in and her catch sold. At first, simply to satisfy her own skepticism about whether the old station could genuinely be brought back to working order, and later, as the weeks passed, bringing him fish she hadn't sold and coffee from the harbor diner. The particular generosity of someone who had decided a young man doing exactly the work she'd spent years wishing somebody would do deserved better than cold rations from a duffel bag. Wasn't going to sell all of it anyway, she'd say, setting down a wrapped fillet, in a tone Reeve was slowly learning meant considerably more than the words themselves let on. Reeve spent his first full week at the lighthouse doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He looked at what was actually broken and started fixing it. The Fresnel lens itself needed only careful cleaning, decades of salt film wiped away with a soft cloth and diluted vinegar solution over several patient days, restoring the glass prisms to a clarity that threw rainbows across the lantern room walls. The first afternoon sunlight passed through them properly again. The lamp mechanism below the lens, a rotating apparatus once turned by a clockwork weight system, had seized where its bearing raceway had corroded, and Reeve spent 4 days freeing the mechanism and repacking the bearing with marine grease he bought with his first week's harbor wages, testing the rotation by hand dozens of times before trusting it to run under its own weight-driven power again. The foghorn compressor took the longest, its belts replaced with stock Reeve found, remarkably intact, in the tower's supply room. Its diesel engine's fuel system cleaned the same patient way he'd learned from his father on a dozen buoy tenders, and its brass horn itself polished and reseated after Reeve discovered a section of corroded mounting bolts that had let the whole assembly shift slightly out of true alignment over the decades. The interval timer, a mechanical device meant to sound the horn in a specific, recognizable pattern rather than a continuous blast, had rusted solid in its housing, and Reeve spent 3 additional days freeing its escapement mechanism and calibrating the timing against the pattern recorded in the station's own original specification plate, still legible though tarnished, bolted inside the service room door. He tested the full assembly repeatedly on short bursts before ever trusting it to run a real cycle, mindful that a horn calibrated wrong could confuse rather than warn the boats it was meant to protect. It was in the tower's supply room, tucked into a metal box behind a stack of old maintenance forms that Reeve found the logbook, its cover reading Aldous Crane, Keeper, Cormorant Point Light, 1931-1968. He read it that same evening by lantern light and understood, well before he'd finished the first section, exactly what the modern solar beacon had never been built to replace. Aldous Crane had kept the light for 37 years, and his logbook recorded, in careful, specific detail, every vessel the light and horn together had guided safely past Cormorant Shoal during weather that would have doomed them otherwise. The horn matters more than the light in this stretch of water, Crane had written in an entry from early in his tenure. A man can't see a lens from inside a fog bank thick enough to swallow his own bowsprit. But sound carries where light cannot, and a horn sounded at the right interval has saved more boats on this shoal than the lens ever will on its own. Anyone who thinks to replace this station with a light alone doesn't understand what actually kept this coast safe. There was a middle entry, dated some 15 years into Crane's tenure, that Reeve found himself returning to more than once in the days that followed. Guided the schooner Rebecca Ann clear of the shoal last night in fog thick enough I couldn't see my own hand at arm's length, using nothing but the horn's interval and her captain's careful dead reckoning against it. He told me afterward he'd have run her aground within the hour without it, same as 3 other vessels have done on this exact shoal in years past when the horn wasn't running due to storm damage or engine trouble. I keep count of these close calls not out of pride, but because I want a record, in case anyone after me ever needs proof that this station's horn is not a luxury. It is the only thing standing between a blind captain and a rock he cannot see. There was a later entry, dated near Crane's retirement, that Reeve read a second time before setting the logbook aside for the night. I've heard talk of automation coming to stations like this one within my lifetime or shortly after it. I don't object to progress, but I fear an automated system will replace the light and call the job finished, never understanding that the horn was always the more important half of what this station did. I hope whoever comes after me, if anyone ever troubles to look, understands that a station like this one was never just a light. It was a light and a voice together, and a coast this dangerous needs both. Reeve closed the logbook and sat with it a long while, understanding that he was holding in his own 2 hands exactly the warning that the Marguerite J's crew had needed 4 years earlier, written down decades before any of them were born, by a man who had understood precisely what would eventually be lost. He thought about his own layoff, about a contractor deciding that a technician who understood both the light and the horn was a redundant expense once a solar beacon could handle half the job automatically, and understood that the exact reasoning that had cost him his own livelihood was the same reasoning that had left the Marguerite J's crew with nothing but a blinking light and no voice at all in a fog thick enough to swallow every other warning. It was not, he thought, a coincidence that the thing that had put him out of work and the thing that had cost 2 men their lives traced back to the same quiet assumption. That half a warning system was close enough to count as the whole of it. By the end of his 5th week, Reeve had brought the entire station through a full test cycle without a single fault, the horn sounding clean and true across the headland for the first time in over a decade, the lens throwing its restored beam out over the water each evening at dusk. A handful of harbor families had begun making the walk up to the lighthouse just to see it, word having spread the way it always did once people noticed lights burning in the tower after dark and heard, faintly, the horn's test blast carrying down to the village on a still evening. The man arrived at the lighthouse on a gray Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after Reeve had begun his work, stepping out of a sedan with a folder of legal documents under one arm and the particular weary formality of a man who had delivered this exact kind of paperwork many times before. "Name's Grady Fenwick," the man said. "I'm a field agent contracted by Cape Holdings, LLC. I've got a formal notice to vacate this property, effective immediately. You're occupying private land without authorization, and the company intends to proceed with development plans that don't accommodate an unauthorized resident." "I understand," Reeve said. Before you serve that notice, I'd ask you to come up and see what I've actually done here first." Fenwick hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to that particular response. "That's not typically part of the process," he said. "It doesn't need to be part of any process," Reeve said. "It'll take 15 minutes, and I think you'll want to know what you're actually evicting before you finish the paperwork." Fenwick followed him up the tower's interior stairs, and Reeve watched something shift in the man's expression as they climbed past the restored lamp mechanism, the cleaned lens-throwing prisms of afternoon light across the walls, and finally into the service room where the rebuilt foghorn compressor sat gleaming with fresh paint and careful maintenance. "This was fully seized when I found it," Reeve said. "All of it. I've restored the lens, the rotation mechanism, and the foghorn compressor over 5 weeks, on my own time and my own dollar, because a boat ran aground on the shoal below us 4 years ago in a fog thick enough that the current solar beacon did nothing to warn them off it. 2 men died. I have the previous keeper's own logbook explaining exactly why a light alone was never enough for this stretch of coast." Fenwick was quiet a long moment, looking at the compressor, then at the logbook Reeve held out to him. "I wasn't told any of this when I was sent out here," he said finally. "I was told an unauthorized squatter needed removing from a vacant historic property the company intends to develop." "I'm not asking you to ignore your instructions," Reeve said. "I'm asking you to see what those instructions are actually asking you to shut down before you finish delivering them." Fenwick read several pages of Crane's logbook standing right there in the service room, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had changed considerably from the tired formality he'd arrived with. "I've served eviction notices for 11 years, he said quietly. "Most of the time it's exactly what it looks like. Somebody occupying property they've got no claim to, and my job's just paperwork after that. I don't think I've ever once been handed a folder that didn't mention the actual reason a place mattered to anyone besides its owner. I still have a legal notice to serve," he said, straightening. "That's not something I can simply decide not to do, but I'm not required to file my completion report until end of week. I'd suggest you use those days well." Word of Fenwick's visit reached Nora Blythe by that same evening, and she came up to the lighthouse herself, standing in the service room with an expression Reeve hadn't seen on her before. "An eviction agent who gave you a few extra days instead of dragging you out the door himself," Nora said. "That's not nothing, Reeve. That's a man deciding on his own that something he saw mattered more than the job he was sent to do. It won't stop Cape Holdings from finishing the eviction eventually," Reeve said. "Maybe not on its own," Nora said. "But if this harbor shows up behind you the way we should have shown up for the Marguerite J's crew before it was too late, I don't think Cape Holdings finds it quite so simple to quietly develop a property that just became the reason half this village didn't lose another boat." The dense fog rolled in 3 days later, thicker than Cormorant Point had seen in years, the kind of fog that swallowed the harbor entirely by mid-morning and showed no sign of lifting by afternoon, trapping 4 fishing boats out past the shoal with no safe way to judge their position relative to the rocks below the surface. It was Nora who reached Reeve first by radio, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who had already lost boats to this exact stretch of water once before. 4 boats out past the shoal, fog thick as anything I've seen in a decade. They can't see the solar beacon at all in this. If you've got that horn running, now's the time." Reeve had the compressor started within minutes, the diesel engine catching on the second try, and the restored foghorn sounded its first blast across Cormorant Point in over a decade, a deep, resonant note that carried out across the water in a way no light ever could have managed through fog that thick. Partway through the second hour, the compressor's temperature gauge crept past the safe range Reeve had tested it against during his repairs. The belts he'd replaced weeks earlier straining under a duty cycle considerably longer than anything he'd run them through before. He eased the interval slightly, giving the engine brief rest periods between blasts rather than the continuous cycle he'd started with, gambling that a marginally longer gap between horn calls was safer than losing the compressor entirely partway through the emergency. The gauge held steady after that, and the horn kept sounding, spaced now at intervals that still matched Crane's recorded pattern closely enough for any listening boat to recognize. Grady Fenwick, who had stayed in the village longer than his assignment strictly required, arrived at the lighthouse partway through the emergency, having heard the horn's first blast from the harbor and understood immediately what it meant. He climbed the tower stairs and found Reeve at the compressor, timing the horn's intervals against Crane's own logbook notes on the shoal's exact bearing from the tower. "What can I do?" Fenwick asked, and Reeve understood, hearing the question, that whatever paperwork the man still carried in his car, it was no longer the only thing on his mind. "Keep the compressor's oil level steady while I work the horn timing," Reeve said. "It hasn't run this long continuously since I rebuilt it, and I don't want to lose it to overheating in the 1 hour it actually matters most." They worked the horn together for nearly 3 hours, Reeve timing the blasts against Crane's recorded intervals, while Fenwick monitored the straining compressor, until all 4 boats, guided by the horn's steady rhythm alone, found their way back around the shoal and into the harbor, safe, if considerably shaken. Nora met them at the dock once the last boat was secured, her face streaked with the particular relief of someone who had spent 3 hours genuinely afraid of a repeat of the Marguerite J. "That horn just did what it was built to do the first time in 4 years anybody's needed it to," she said. "I don't think there's a person in this harbor who'll forget that any time soon." The captain of the last boat to come in, a weathered man Reeve hadn't met before, climbed onto the dock still shaking slightly from the strain of 3 hours navigating blind, and gripped Reeve's hand without a word for a long moment before finally speaking. "Heard that horn and knew exactly where I was for the first time all morning," he said. "Been fishing this water 30 years. Never once thought I'd hear it running again in my lifetime." He looked up at the tower, visible now as the fog finally began to lift. "Whatever it took to get that thing working again, son, it mattered a great deal more than you probably know standing up there timing it." Word of the fog rescue spread through the harbor and beyond it within days, and Nora organized a formal petition drive that gathered signatures from nearly every fishing family along that stretch of coast, along with written statements from 2 of the 4 boat captains who'd been guided home by the horn that morning. She hand-delivered the petition to Cape Holdings' regional office herself, along with a copy of a local newspaper article covering the rescue, and told Reeve afterward that she'd made a point of leaving a photograph of the Marguerite J's memorial marker on the receptionist's desk before she left, so that nobody at the company could claim afterward they hadn't understood exactly what was at stake. Grady Fenwick filed his completion report the following week, but not the one Cape Holdings had expected. He recommended in writing that the company's development plans be suspended pending a review of the lighthouse's demonstrated ongoing value as an active maritime safety asset, attaching Aldous Crane's logbook and a first-hand account of the fog emergency as supporting documentation. "I don't know if it'll change their minds," Fenwick told Reeve before he left Cormorant Point for good. Companies don't always listen to field agents who tell them their development plans have a problem. But I couldn't file a report pretending I hadn't seen what I saw in that fog. I'd rather lose the contract than do that. Cape Holdings LLC did not immediately abandon its development plans, but the combination of Fenwick's report, the harbor's own petition drive, and regional news coverage of the fog rescue put enough public pressure on the company that it agreed within 3 months to lease the lighthouse and its surrounding acre back to the county at a nominal rate, on the condition that the light and horn remain in active maintenance as a recognized maritime safety station. Reeve stayed on as the lighthouse's caretaker, a position the county formalized once the lease was finalized, and he kept Aldous Crane's logbook in the same supply room where he'd found it, alongside a second logbook of his own. On its first page, he wrote the only sentence that felt honest enough to begin with. This station was almost lost because a company only saw the land beneath it, not the coast it was still protecting. Keeper Crane knew a light alone was never enough. I intend to keep both the light and the voice running, for as long as this coast needs them together. Reeve wrote to his own father that winter, describing the restored horn and lens in more detail than the man probably needed, but would certainly appreciate. 8 months of feeling like his particular skills no longer had a place in the world, finally answered by a coast that needed exactly what he knew how to do. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief in the way Reeve remembered him always being. Told you a light alone never did the whole job on a coast like that. Proud of you for understanding what the budget cuts never bothered to. Your grandfather kept a station like that one for 20 years. Sounds like you found your way back to the family trade after all. Grady Fenwick wrote to Reeve once more, some months later, from a different job in a different state, mentioning that he'd left contract eviction work entirely and taken a position with a historic preservation trust instead. Never expected a squatter to change my whole career, he wrote. Glad you asked me to climb those stairs before I finished the paperwork. I don't think I'd have forgiven myself if I hadn't. Nora Blythe stopped by the lighthouse most weeks after that, not always with news, sometimes only to stand in the service room and listen to the horn's test cycle, the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 4 years fighting for exactly this kind of second chance, and had finally been allowed to stop merely fighting for it. The two harbor hands who'd once mocked Reeve on the pier became, in the months that followed, two of the first to volunteer help whenever the lighthouse needed an extra pair of hands for maintenance, neither of them ever quite apologizing outright for their earlier comments, but both showing up often enough that Reeve stopped thinking much about it at all. The village held a small ceremony that spring to formally rededicate the station under its new county lease. Nothing elaborate, just the harbor community and a handful of officials gathered at the tower's base, while the restored horn sounded a single test blast across water, calm and clear enough for once that nobody actually needed it. Nora spoke briefly, mentioning the Marguerite J by name for the first time Reeve had heard her say it in public, and the crowd went quiet in a way that told him the wreck had never once stopped mattering to this harbor, whatever official report had tried to call it. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many warning systems get quietly reduced to half of what they used to be, simply because the easier half was the only one anybody thought worth automating? And what does it take? A fog, a stranger, a keeper's careful logbook, and one agent willing to climb the stairs before finishing his paperwork, for the whole warning to finally be restored. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.